With its rocky history of violent civil wars, military coups, and strongman warlords, very few outside observers would have expected the Republic of Liberia to be the nation that would produce Africa's first ever female head of state. Referred to as Africa's Iron Lady, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf made history in January 2006 when she was inaugurated as Liberia's first female president. Sirleaf's election was celebrated all around the world as a truly momentous occasion and a groundbreaking step in the push for women's empowerment in Africa. However, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's 12 years at the helm of one of Africa's most volatile nations would be a bittersweet mixture of great triumph and great disappointment. You see, Liberia's story is very unique in that it was the only West African country to have never been colonized by the European powers. The nation was founded by freed African Americans who emigrated from the United States with the aspiration of establishing a free republic on the continent. In 1822, the American Colonization Society began sending Black Americans back to Africa, and over the course of 4 decades, some 13,000 former slaves and their descendants moved to Africa to start a new life, in the territory which would eventually be known as Liberia, the Land of Liberty. But contrary to the utopian aspirations of its founders, the Land of Liberty would ultimately fail to live up to its name. Having been completely cut off from the culture and heritage of their African ancestors, Liberia's African American immigrants simply could not assimilate with the tribal societies of the indigenous populations they came into contact with. Most of the new arrivals were so steeped in American culture that apart from their physical appearance, they found nothing in common with the indigenous populations. And so rather than integrate with the indigenous communities, the African American immigrants separated themselves and essentially formed a new tribe of Americo-Liberians by choosing to only marry within the community and by holding tightly to the American traditions and beliefs which they considered superior to the indigenous norms and traditions. Thanks to their formal education, Western cultural norms, and connections to influential American politicians and businessmen, the Americo-Liberians would become Liberia's de facto political and economic elite. And in an ironic twist of fate, the Americo-Liberians would go from oppressed to oppressor as they denied the indigenous population civic rights in much the same way as the white elites in America were treating the black population. Within a few years after the arrival of the Americo-Liberians, large numbers of indigenous Liberians would find themselves working in fields and on rubber plantations, producing cash crops for exportation by Americo-Liberian companies. Arbitrary taxes would also be imposed on indigenous communities by Americo-Liberian politicians. With their flamboyant American-style hoop skirts and tailcoats, elaborate church buildings and Masonic lodges, the Americo-Liberians would ultimately create a dystopian society in which the American South of the 1800s was recreated on African soil, with the Americo-Liberians playing the role of the white elite and the indigenous populations playing the role of the black underclass. Tensions between the Americo-Liberian community and the indigenous population would build over the years, and at the time of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's birth in 1938, Liberian society was pretty much strictly divided between the wealthy and powerful Americo-Liberian population and the disenfranchised and poor indigenous Liberians. Rather interestingly, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's upbringing placed her right in between these two very different worlds. Her father was the first indigenous Liberian to serve in the country's parliament, and so despite her indigenous Gola and Crow heritage, she was able to gain access to privileges that historically would have been limited to members of the Americo-Liberian class. After attending a string of elite schools and universities, Sirleaf was appointed as the Minister of Finance in the largely Americo-Liberian government of Liberia's 20th President, William Tolbert. However, on the 12th of April 1980, Master Sergeant Samuel Doe, an indigenous Liberian soldier, forcefully seized power from William Tolbert in a violent outburst of the long-standing tensions between the Americo-Liberian and indigenous populations. Upon seizing power, Doe ordered the execution by firing squad of all but 4 members of his cabinet. Sirleaf was one of the 4 remaining, and although she initially accepted a post in the new government as president of the Liberian Bank for Development and Investment, she eventually fled the country in November 1980 after publicly criticizing Doe and his group of revolutionaries for their mismanagement of the country. Seeking to legitimize his government in the eyes of the international community, the Doe regime would call a general election in 1985, and Sirleaf would return to Liberia to run for vice president alongside presidential candidate Jackson Doe. But shortly after her arrival, she was placed under house arrest and sentenced to 10 years in prison for the crime of sedition after a bold speech in which she allegedly insulted senior members of Samuel Doe's government. Following the public outcry surrounding her arrest, she was pardoned by Samuel Doe but was forced to run for a senatorial seat instead of vice president. Samuel Doe's party would ultimately win the 1985 elections, but though Sirleaf was declared the winner of her senatorial seat, she refused to accept the seat in protest of the general election, which she believed had been shamelessly rigged by the government. Shortly afterwards, Sirleaf was again arrested and imprisoned on trumped-up charges by Doe's forces from November 1985 to July 1986. Upon her release, she again fled the country and moved to the United States. A rebellion led by the now infamous Charles Taylor's National Patriotic Front against Samuel Doe's government in 1989 led to the outbreak of the First Liberian Civil War. Though Sirleaf raised money to support Charles Taylor's forces, which helped further their cause, relations between Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and Charles Taylor eventually deteriorated as she opposed Taylor's recklessness in the war and his brutal repression of rival opposition leaders. The First Liberian Civil War would continue for 7 brutal years, during which Samuel Doe was assassinated and a separate battle arose between Charles Taylor's National Patriotic Front and the breakaway Independent National Patriotic Front, led by Prince Yomi Johnson. The hostilities were eventually brought to an end by ECOWAS peacekeeping forces, and Sirleaf again returned to Liberia to contest for presidency in the subsequent 1997 general election. Unfortunately, she stumbled at the first hurdle, losing at the primaries to Charles Taylor, and was again forced out of the country following trumped-up charges by Charles Taylor loyalists. However, within just 2 years, a second violent civil war broke out in Liberia, and 4 years later, Charles Taylor was exiled with a transitional government set up to oversee a peaceful transition of power. Sirleaf again returned to Liberian politics to serve in the transitional government as the head of the Governance Reform Commission. In the first elections after the Second Civil War, Sirleaf again ran for president, and to the surprise of many, her challenger would be none other than George Weah, the 3-time African Footballer of the Year and the only African winner of the Ballon d'Or award. But despite her superior educational background and deep political history, Sirleaf would initially place second in the first round of voting before finally winning the subsequent runoff election with 59% of the votes. Running against a true man's man in George Weah, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf adopted the moniker Ma Ellen and positioned herself to the Liberian electorate as the maternal figure the people needed to rebuild the country after it was torn apart by 2 brutal civil wars, which had been fueled in part by the male egos of the key belligerents. Johnson Sirleaf's brand of maternal politics would charm the public and effectively mobilize a large voting bloc of Liberian market women to vote for her in record numbers. Ma Ellen began her presidency with a series of face-to-face meetings with Liberians in the country's 15 geopolitical regions to discuss key issues of national concern and promote a climate of reconciliation. This connection to the grassroots of Liberian society would be one of the defining features of her government. In close consultation with market women and other members of the Liberian working class, she would develop Liberia's first poverty reduction strategy and set out to allocate funds to development projects based on what was most important to the general population. Recognizing the important role played by market women, who conducted an estimated 85% of all agricultural trading activities in Liberia, Sirleaf would place them at the forefront of her policies. Working alongside a number of NGOs, she established the Sirleaf Market Women's Fund, which was aimed at rebuilding the country's market infrastructure following the civil wars, providing basic literacy and numeracy training to market women, and increasing the access to investment capital through microcredit facilities. The Sirleaf Market Women's Fund would also provide market women with safe storage facilities for their goods, and also allow their children access to daycares and preschool services. Following the lawlessness that had accompanied Liberia's civil wars, cases of sexual abuse, domestic violence, and other forms of attacks on women had become rampant in Liberian society. Responding to the crisis, Sirleaf's administration enacted important institutional reforms focusing on women's freedom from sexual violence. Her administration would pass one of the most comprehensive anti-rape legislations in Africa and also develop detailed plans to promote gender equality, combat gender-based violence, and promote the education of young girls. Her efforts would not go unnoticed. In 2011, she was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize alongside the Liberian peace activist Lema Bowe for her efforts to make Liberia a shining example in the arena of women's empowerment. However, despite the very many impressive strides made by Ma Ellen to promote gender equality in Liberia, a number of feminist scholars would claim that her policies did not do enough to promote women's empowerment. Her party was criticized by feminist groups as it ranked at the bottom of all major Liberian parties in terms of the total number of female candidates put forward for major positions. Her government was also criticized for refusing to approve several laws aimed at guaranteeing female representation in Liberian politics, and also failing to eradicate the practice of female genital mutilation, which she had pledged to wipe out during her election campaign. Her image as a feminist icon in Western media circles was also brought into question as she unapologetically distanced herself from feminist ideology, stating that she considered feminism to be a form of extremism. And to the disappointment of many feminist observers, Sirleaf's Liberia was ranked 97th out of 153 countries in the Global Gender Gap Index, far behind other African countries such as Paul Kagame's Rwanda, which was ranked 9th in the world thanks to its 50% plus representation of women in parliament. But would it not be unfair and perhaps even sexist to judge the performance of Africa's first female leader from a purely gender-based perspective, especially considering that she was not elected to solve women's issues alone? Considering the 14 years of carnage that preceded her presidency, her overall achievements as Liberia's leader are actually quite impressive. Over the course of her 12 years in office, from 2006 to 2018, her government made significant investments into rebuilding the nation's devastated education infrastructure and worked to rehabilitate the thousands of former child soldiers who had been traumatized by years of fighting. Her government also successfully negotiated over $4.6 billion in debt relief and development grants and managed to grow the annual national budget from $80 million to $516 million. But just like her male counterparts in Africa and across the world, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's presidency was also plagued by many failures which continued to undermine her legacy. Despite accusing former President William Tolbert of nepotism in the 1970s, Ma Ellen herself would be accused of nepotism. When faced directly with questions surrounding her appointment of her sons, Charles, Fomba and Robert Sirleaf, to senior posts at the Central Bank of Liberia, the National Security Agency, and the National Oil Company of Liberia respectively, Ma Ellen would simply point to the high-profile cases of nepotistic practices within the Trump administration as her defense. In fact, throughout the course of her tenure as president, over 20 members of her family would be appointed to key positions in the government, and to the anger of even her most fervent supporters, she would oversee the award of concessions amounting to over 1/3 of Liberia's landmass to multinational corporations. Over 40% of the country's forests would be acquired by foreign logging companies, and her administration would be caught in a myriad of corruption scandals that would severely smear her image as the mother of the nation. But while her status as a feminist icon and her corruption record may be up for debate, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's status as a giant in modern African history is undisputable. Becoming the continent's first elected female head of state against a backdrop of sharp ethnic tensions and civil wars, she successfully kept her country together and saw it through a difficult post-war period. And regardless of what her critics might say, her election as Africa's first female leader was indeed a landmark moment in modern African history. Indeed, since her election, Africa has seen the emergence of more female presidents such as Joyce Banda, the first female president of Malawi, Amina Gurib Fakim of Mauritius, and most recently, the first Ethiopian female president, Sahle-Work Zewde. But while there is no doubt a stark difference between the high praise she received in Western media circles and the harsh realities of her many failings as a leader, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf can at least be celebrated by both Liberians and non-Liberians alike for bringing stability to one of the most turbulent nations in Africa, overseeing a peaceful transition of power, and, in some regards, leaving her nation in a better position than when she took office. Once again, thank you for watching New Africa. If you've enjoyed this video and would like to see more content like this, then please like and share this video, and also consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/newafrica. Thanks again for your support, and until next time.